The Spiritual Scientist podcast is joined today by Sean Macleod. Sean's a musician, songwriter, and author with a deep interest in philosophy and particularly the work of Rudolf Steiner. And he teaches film, music, and media studies at Limerick College in Ireland. And he's finished off a PhD at the University of Limerick regarding music and anthroposophy. I can't think of anything better I'd rather do a PhD on. And Sean's the author of a couple of books, The Girl Groups of the 60s and a book on Phil Spector, and a new book which I've had the privilege of having a little scan of at least had a scan of the contents page. And that's on the Beatles. It's called Behind the Wall of Illusion, the Religious, Esoteric and Occult World of the Beatles, or Worlds of the Beatles. Maybe I got that wrong. Anyway, welcome, Sean. Thanks very much for joining me. First thing I want to ask you is, are you going to ruin my lifelong love of the Beatles with your book?
Well, maybe. In what way would I ruin it?
No, I don't. I don't know. No.
What's your perspective?
Wrong question. Wrong question to start with, basically. No. Please just.
It's a good question, I think, because it's interesting to see what I don't know what the my perspective on the Beatles was. I think it's when I was 11, as I was just telling you earlier, I was sitting watching it. Actually, a television program called Fame. I don't know if you remember it, from the 1980s. And well, anyway, this episode they had a guest singer on it. A guest. He was a story about this boy who had problems in school, and at the end he sings this song, and my solar plexus just kind of went kind of crazy. And at the end of the song, I kind of knew the song. I hadn't heard it before, but I kind of rushed home and found the sheet music that we had at home, and it was Penny Lane, and because they mentioned it was Penny Lane's song. And I found it. I knew it was a Beatles song then, and so it wasn't the Beatles singing it or anything. It was just this guy who turned out to be Jimmy Osmond, and you can see the clip on YouTube. It was just accompanied with piano, and the next day I was coming home from school. And there used to be this kind of record shop in the days there were record shops. I think it was called Music Man. And I used to pass it every day. And there was a copy of the Beatles Rock and Roll Volume 2 for, I think, £1. Just in front of me as I walked through the aisle of the supermarket, of the store. And I went home and I got £1 off my mum. And the next day I went and I bought it. And I brought it home and I put it on, and my whole life just changed, Like every song was just, it was just incredible. And years later, I ended up listening. I heard Rock and Roll Volume 1. And I kind of thought, if that had been on the stand and I bought that, I don't think I would ever have been really a Beatles fan, because it was all these really early recordings, and the mixture of stuff wasn't as wide, and there were kind of old rock and roll covers. It's not as good an album by any stretches of the imagination as the Volume 2 is, which goes from some Hard Day's Night songs right up to Get Back stuff. And I really, so from the point of view of anthroposophy, there is a moment of your karma or your destiny coming to meet you, and I very definitely had that sense of that was being set on a journey at that moment. And I'm still on this journey, which happened with that song. And is a similar thing that happened with anthroposophy. I think my introduction to anthroposophy, not as profound, I don't think. And also a similar thing with literature, which is why I kind of got interested in literature. But that moment is so profound for me, that TV show. And so the Beatles have always been a really positive experience for me, and so that's why I'm wondering, when you say that, I guess you also mean they were a huge positive
Yeah,
experience
absolutely.
for you.
Absolutely, yeah. So Dad played in bands, and we always had those Beatles records, in the house, and it was just, I think I've got a very early memory of, I think I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I had the Sergeant Pepper's LP, and a friend of mine, Mick McCann, and myself, we just listened to it over and over and over again, and it's just, if I hear it now, it's just this magical time. And when I first heard it, I was always thinking, I couldn't work out which bit I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of, whatever I heard on there, I wanted to be able to do it, and I couldn't work out if I wanted to sing that bit or play the guitar on that bit or play the bass on that bit. I couldn't work out what to do, but I had to do something with it, and that, I think it partly led me to become a songwriter as well, singer songwriter. But I'd be really interested to know how you sort of tie together or bring together in this book that's coming out, the pop music world, or the world of the Beatles, and the spiritual stuff, if you know what I mean, for want of a better term. But
Yeah,
there's a lot. As I say, I've had a look through the book, and it looks really dense and interesting, dense in a good way.
yeah.
But a couple of points. But maybe if you want to just mention a little bit about how those things come together, anthroposophy and the Beatles.
Well, I guess, yeah, that's as I was saying there, I think for me it was when I often read anthroposophy and this super sensible world, this other world that is behind or infused with this world in a way that we tend to ignore a lot. As I was saying, that experience I had even as 11, I became aware of the fact that there are things working within this world that, we don't see them in the same materialistic way that we see the physical world, but you can feel those very definite and very precise links, connections, that weave through our lives. So as I was saying, like, there's the song, it was seeing that particular album that was there. It wasn't, I didn't have to go into the shop and try and find, the Beatles and look through albums and go, which will I buy? It was there saying, here I am, this is a door has been opened. And if it had been volume 1, I don't think I would have had the same experience. So something behind something orchestrated all those events,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very clear to me as I was going through this process, that this was all happening, and so that's the first thing, just my own experience of it. So I can really understand Steiner talking about these things, because I had that experience on a number of levels, but that one particularly. And I think it's very important to become aware of these events in our lives, because recently I read Steiner talks about there are 2 impulses. One that comes from the moon, and this is like a moon impulse where destiny comes to meet you, and then the sun impulse where we go to meet our destiny, and how we do that, and how we take hold of it. And so for me, I got interested in wanting to be a songwriter, a bit like what you were saying there, Mick. I didn't really know what to do. I mean, I was made study the piano, like your piano lessons, or your classical piano, and I didn't really understand why I was doing this. Like, and it didn't mean anything to me. But once the Beatles, that experience happened, a door opened up, and I realized it's great to I guess maybe later, I was a little bit older when I realized it's great to play these classical pieces and all, but it's not part of my destiny, really. It's a simple pop songs in a way is. And I think when we stick with those things that we're being asked to do, then we don't get caught up in our, we are aware of those destiny moments and stick to them. We don't get caught up in the intellectualism, the problems that we create in our head and get in our own way. And so, so these sun forces, I took that destiny moment and I started to learn how to write songs and make my own music. And so from that perspective, I could really understand Steiner, what he's talking about. How does on another level, that's not just my personal experience, I think anthroposophy is in everything. It's everything that we live in. But so I sometimes I find with anthroposophy, because Steiner died the time he died, it's a little bit like not all anthroposophists, but there's a tendency, I think, to another anthroposophist friend of mine once said, how many anthroposophists does it take to change a light bulb? Do you know this joke?
No, I don't know this one.
No, because Steiner never talked about changing light bulbs. And I think this, so he didn't talk about the Beatles, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't talk about World War II, and he didn't talk about what's happening today, obviously. And that's up to us then to bring anthroposophy, in a way, and spiritual science into the world we're living in today. And so I think, the 60s definitely was a very rich cultural period, and it needs to be looked at from the perspective of spiritual science.
Okay, yeah.
And while I think the Beatles, for me, were hugely positive, and I think at the time they seemed to bring a tremendous amount of joy into a lot of people's lives at the time. I think one can say they are a very positive force, nearly like a sun force, for the 60s, the early 60s particularly. And then I think things seem to change somewhere along the way. And when I begin to look deeper into the Beatles, the music, the culture, as it starts to change, and it in the individual characters in the story, it starts to become a little bit more shadowy in a way. Mm-hmm. And that's quite interesting as well, because there is always a shadow, and the shadow is, it's important to help us move on in a way. So I did, not to destroy your
no
solid image of the Beatles. I think it's good to and actually it affected me looking at certain things where you think, oh God, do I really want to go here and explore this area? But you do. You just say, okay, this is the way it is, and that's okay, and so ultimately, yeah, I wanted to really know what was behind. Was it a positive force behind the Beatles, or was there, as some people start to, you hear a lot of these, negative elements, whether there was like Tavistock mind control behind it, or other forces at work, or destroying old values, pre-war values, and were they responsible in a way for the breakdown of the family, for the inverting things in society and stuff like that? They're all big questions, I think, that you can't really say yes or no. It's in some ways, yeah, and that some ways that's good, and other ways I don't think so. So yeah, I was trying to now give this perspective, I think. And
Yeah,
I
well,
think another thing as well is, I think this idea of consciousness soul, I think really, I feel really is connected with the 60s, but and with this music for the general masses. I think in a way the 60s was working class people, everyday people. It wasn't, whereas the ancient mysteries, you had to be an initiated into an awakening of some sort. And it seemed to me that an interest in esoteric knowledge and the having a strong sense of I, and your philosophers like Hegel, and maybe your poets like Coleridge, or they had this capacity. But and maybe if you were educated in that sense, you were given a privilege to awaken your higher faculties in a way. But I think really the 60s in a way allowed that it was a kind of, I think, an initiation for everybody, particularly in the Western world. On one level, it was everybody suddenly woke up to the fact that they could all be artists. They could all express their story through music or film or painting or theater or whatever area they wanted. And I think that was, it wasn't open to everybody then. And I think the Beatles in a way represented that you could be working class. You didn't have to go to a conservatoire of music, or you didn't have to, anybody could. It was the democratization of the way of being allowed to have access to higher realms of knowledge. And I think that is initiated through a lot of the music of the 60s and the Beatles as well. I don't know if you'd agree with me in that, but
yeah. I don't know if I've thought about it that way actually before. I have, like you're saying before. I think it's a great way to answer that question. I sort of was kind of joking with my question at the start about, are you going to ruin my conception of the Beatles, these childhood heroes? But the way you've answered the question is to show that, there is this sun-like element to them, but also possibly this other element. And to come to the point of asking about the revolution, in a sense, cultural revolution of the 60s, I don't have a firm opinion on it. You do get the crowd that sort of suggests before that time it was family values, and the family unit was still secure, that our institutions were still strong, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I don't know if that's really true or not. I'm sort of open to different opinions about that. And when you talk about as well, some people talk about the Beatles being a kind of a result of Tavistock, the Tavistock thing, and that actually they're controlled and everything like that. I mean, maybe the powers that be took what was there and started to steer it in their own directions. I don't know, but I'm just really interested to hear your perspectives on it.
Yeah, so I think it seems that because in Britain and America, I think I guess Terry Boardman would be more of an authority on this, but that a lot of, John Lennon said they were the first generation not to be sent off to die. and that's quite a remarkable thing to say, that the generation before them was sent off to be shot at in World War II, and the generation before them was sent off to World War One. And I think definitely if we take anthroposophy as a kind of a signpost as to where things are, and Terry talked about this in the last episode in your interview with him there recently, of the coming of age of humanity in the 20th and now the 21st century. That if anthroposophy suddenly kind of enters the scene just before the 20th century, and we have the lifting of Kali Yuga and the Michael Age and this, as we begin to enter more deeply into these kind of, the time seems right for this spiritual awakening. Young people are, and it's been distorted by these wars and these things that are happening within Europe and America, particularly, and young people are being sent off to die, really. Then the first opportunity for them to suddenly have their say, to become their own identities, is really in the 60s. So and I think it's family values. I mean, I don't think it's to say that maybe families didn't have their problems, but I think I don't think people were as aware of themselves as individuals. In general, there are definitely people who were aware of themselves as individuals, but as I said, I think they were like the poets and the philosophers and these people, and your everyday person wasn't so much so, and so I think that's quite remarkable as well for the Beatles, for these young guys to suddenly begin to see themselves as having their identity, and I think even prior to that, I don't know if even people like Elvis and that were so conscious of their own identity in the same way,
Right.
And it's what's interesting about that, I think, as well, is because the media, particularly television and this kind of thing, seems to reflect back to people this sense of their identity. And what I mean by that is, I think today we've become so self-conscious because of our media, particularly social media.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody can now be on the TV, like now,
Like right now.
and
Yeah.
so they're so caught up with their own self identity, like a hyper self. And I think when you look at the Beatles, they didn't really have that, because they were only beginning to become, and they were the kind of start of this self-conscious, self-reflective, looking at themselves constantly through the medium of television, or and because when you start to see this development through pop culture, you realize the bands and the artists start becoming more and more self-conscious, and you can see it in how they are photographed, and they've learned how to do this.
Yeah, that's right. I was just thinking about those early interviews with the Beatles, like when they're first standing in front of a camera, or even Bob Dylan, when you see him really young, he's first in front of the camera, they're asking him questions. He's not pretending to be anything. He's not styling himself in any way, or maybe he's got an idea of how he wants to come across, but they seem so sort of just natural and or even naive a little bit, and it's really endearing actually to look back at those things, and then as you say, you compare them to the stars of today who know exactly how to stand to look, so that their body looks the right with the right pose and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, this is really interesting what you're saying about this cultural change. So with the 60s being like an awakening, I mean, of course, a lot of people, it's, if it was an awakening, it kind of didn't work in the end. I mean, it didn't kind of wake the whole of humanity up, and now we're all purely enlightened beings or anything like that. So what do you think, if I can ask about that, what do you think happened? Was there some other aspect that came in and took hold of what could have been a positive thing?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's an interesting question because, so Steiner talks about the Christ experience, having the Christ experience from the 1930s, the Christ in the etheric realm.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess there are some who feel that the Nazis and the World War II and this thing was the kind of a shadow over that for humanity to have this experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, in a way, now this is just me wondering, I don't have a definite question. It's something I think I kind of try to explore a little bit in one of the chapters of the book, that the 60s, I feel it did have this kind of sun experience, this kind of uplifting element, some of which was manufactured without a doubt. It was manufactured in a way, but you can't manufacture something that isn't there to begin with, So the time was ready for, I guess, after 2 world wars and after, this kind of, social and cultural devastation, and just the sense of the feelings people must have had after these wars anyway, that the time was kind of ripe for something uplifting and positive. And I think these 4 guys from Liverpool were a kind of a catalyst for this. They were a vehicle to allow it to come about, but a vehicle to allow all the people from who they represented, young people, working class people, basically anybody who could feel they can do this, they can express themselves and they can write songs, and it happened everywhere. It happened with Dylan, as you said, and it happened with groups like the Beach Boys, and all these young people suddenly are playing music and writing songs, and it had never happened before. So that is an awakening in itself, that suddenly, and I think you and I, having grown up with that, and even Terry, who was a musician himself at some point.
Was he Terry Boardman? That's so Sean's referring to Terry, who I interviewed in the last episode. I didn't realize he was a musician, really.
Yeah, and so I grew up with everybody who I knew playing music, played the guitar, played.
Yeah, same here. Me and all my mates. I mean, I was also into Aussie rules football, but apart from that, but we had a group of friends. We had a band. Yeah, this is the way it was.
Yeah, and there was so many people around who wrote their own songs, and I mean, where I live today, like there's loads of people around, and they have songwriters nights everywhere, and people go and write songs, and so in a way, it has succeeded in. We have all become composers and songwriters and are able to express ourselves that way. And I don't think that would be possible for everybody to have done that. I mean, you couldn't even get a guitar. I mean, you could play music, sure, but you didn't. I don't think nobody wrote songs about how they felt or what they thought, and now everybody nearly can, at least can do it. and a lot of people do it.
Even in
Whether
Limerick, people didn't even do it. Even in Limerick, I mean, you live in a place called Limerick, man.
Oh yeah, they write their own limericks. It's funny, young people who are they're all rappers and stuff now, but I think that in itself is a huge revolution, that has kept is still going. That people have the ability to express themselves and to work things that are going on inside them out through these, and I yeah, it's something I might come back to, but I think that's kind of interesting, that. But so I think it allowed for, and not just the Beatles, but you had suddenly working class actors, working class playwrights, working class filmmakers, all in the 60s. This, and then women as well could suddenly start to write their own music or be in bands. And so the Beatles' appearance in Ed Sullivan Show, just set off loads of girls wanting to be in bands as well, and write their own music and that kind of thing, which they hadn't done before, really. So groups like that came, like the Bangles or the Runaways or Susie Quattro, or they Blondie, they had this experience as well, that, oh, I could do that. And that was because the Beatles showed them that they could do this, and I've met people from, who were a little bit older than me, grew up with them, and they were like, yeah, that's why we all joined bands and tried to start playing music, and because of the Beatles. So I think that's very important. While you're talking there about this kind of, we're not living in kind of, some kind of brotherhood and paradise that was promised through the 60s. Yeah, I think that seemed to in a way not succeed so much. And I wonder about that. Yeah. So I wonder, was the 60s in a way, and the shadow side of it, to some extent, to again distract us from having this Christ experience? And that is something that, yeah, it's possible that whole cultural revolution became in one way focused on drugs and fashion, and the idea of, I suppose, and it happened because people had money and people had more freedom to do, and so in a way they maybe are distracted by these materialistic things, and that sounds a little bit like, well, you can only have a Christ experience if you're kind of living in misery or something. But so, and when it comes to the whole drug culture, which was obviously pivotal to particularly the second half of the Beatles' career, in a way, and from 1965 on, I think in the 60s, it was very drug heavy. And that in a way isn't good. Like, I don't think that's particularly good. But at the same time, I think those drug experiences allow one to break out of the paradigms and the conditionings that they're in. And in that sense, it is good. And I think in that sense, the Beatles and that culture began. So when Steiner started to introduce karma and reincarnation into the West and back into our consciousness, it became again something that the whole culture was aware of and understood because of the Beatles' own journey in that direction.
Oh yeah. That I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, okay. And so when it comes to the, just to go to the look at the title of your book, Behind the Wall of Illusion, so that religious, esoteric, and occult worlds of the Beatles. I always like to flag this up because a lot of people today talk about esoteric and occult, and they only use the words in completely a negative sense. So occult just means hidden. And I listen
Yeah.
to a lot of Jay Dyer. You haven't heard of him, but Jay Dyer's he's a philosopher, and he's a cult. He talks a lot about geopolitics, a lot about cultural phenomenon, film, and stuff like that. And he's really great thinker. Really understands the whole what's been going on the last few years and more. And but they're also, a lot of these people are Orthodox Christians, so they're really going back to clinging on to the dogmas from the church. And I think what they miss because they're always talking about the occult, the occult, always in a negative sense. And of course, it has got negative connotations in some ways, but it just means hidden. And I really want to get on there and say, hey, look, guys, there's occult aspects to the Bible. There's occult aspects to the rituals you're performing every Sunday. And that just means there are hidden aspects to it. So I like to sort of demystify the word a little bit. It just means hidden. And so just to come to that point, what do you mean by the religious, esoteric, and occult world of the Beatles, or worlds of the Beatles? What are you referring to there?
So I think with the esoteric, referring to things of a non-materialistic nature, that there are spiritual elements at work behind these things. So one of the chapters I called Beatlemania and the Cult of Dionysus. So I think these elements of Dionysian, Apollonian elements are very much part of this Beatles experience.
Could you just, for the listeners, just explain a little bit about what you mean by that, the Dionysus, etc.?
Yeah, so I think I think in a way we in some ways we live in this kind of Apollonian a culture, in a way, which I think was very much focused on becoming conscious of ourselves, very much reasoning, the philosophical thought. Even I would say Western music and how it developed is a kind of an Apollonian kind of in an Apollonian form. And it's about us becoming aware of who we are as individuals, which is why I think, so from Plato on, this theme became part of the philosophical tradition, where we can start to work things out and find answers for ourselves through logic and reason, etc., etc. And that very much brings us into I am here and the world is out there, and I can understand it. And so with Steiner's philosophy of freedom, I think part of it is, he talks about thinking is our experience of the world is we become separate from it, and we can then start to try to understand it. But there's a kind of another aspect, which is we need to then come back into a relationship with everything else. And this, in a way, I think was the Dionysian element, reconnecting with the primordial forces of the world and feeling a connection with everybody and everything. And they're complicated subjects, but I think in essence, that's the idea. And there's an intuitiveness to that Dionysian element. And so in a way, music in a way is intuitive, you know, but it has become kind of part of this Apollinian stream in that we start to learn to write music and to read music and to theorize over music, and to where the musical score or the written text becomes the music in a way, and nearly more important. And folk music and I think pop music doesn't really bother too much with that. It's more about just picking up the instrument or sitting down and playing it. And, you know, if you take the washboard and put a string on a pole and you can make any sound, and
Yes.
you know, it's intuitive and it's imaginative and it's all these elements, and people feel a togetherness with it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so in a way the Beatles started to bring this element into, again, the common. So when people would go to the Dionysian rituals, everybody was welcome. If you were an outcast, if you were, you know, a slave, or women particularly. So it welcomed everybody in, and everybody felt part of this oneness. And then Dionysus would get ripped limb from limb, and there's this element to it. And so kind of the tearing at, you know, the Beatles, or the tearing at the hair and all these. I think these Dionysian elements were beginning to rise again in the culture.
That's an interesting take. Yeah, because again, a lot of people that I hear talking about this kind of stuff now, when they refer back to the sort of, you know, pagan cults that took place and pagan rituals and things like that, they're always looking at them in terms of today and saying, you know, that was just pure evil. That was, you know, it's this occult evil connection all the time. But they never kind of meant, they never, and this is where Steiner's really, it's where Steiner's really, really helpful, because he puts it in the sense of the evolution of consciousness, you know. So things that went on back then were, you know, right for the time, for that group of people, right for that particular culture, but not necessarily right for now. But that's not what you're saying. You're not saying it's we're now going to be performing these rituals again. You're just saying, well, what how would you explain it, what you're saying about it?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is true. Yeah, they all of these things were considered evil because they were a part of the evolution of consciousness. We had to, like, so Plato's Republic, Plato says the pipes, which were the instrument of the satyrs, which were Dionysian, were put outside the Republic. They didn't want them in the Republic. They
Right.
wanted
Yes.
only the lyre. They only wanted the lyre, which was Apollo's instrument, and this was the instrument of pure tone in a way. There's no body in the instrument, you know. So you're into the world of mathematics and purity and this Apollonian way of developing, and that was necessary. We needed to do that because we needed to develop our I consciousness, and we needed to develop capitalism and go, this is mine and it's not yours, and we needed to develop that so we could become individuals. And now that we have become individuals, we need to recognize the individual in everyone, and the community needs to recognize the importance of the individual, and the individual needs to recognize their place in the community, as Steiner said. And so this Dionysian element that brings us back into community, I think now is, and Nietzsche talks about this in his Birth of Tragedy, this element needs to come back, or we'll end up becoming, I think, we'll become disconnected from humanity. We'll become so isolated in our own self through probably computers, and this Dionysian element possibly needs to come back into culture. And I think the 60s allowed this to some extent, and it allowed it for everybody. So whether you were rich or poor, man or woman, girl, boy, everyone was welcome to this, take part in this. And I think that's why it was universal. I mean, I think George Harrison mentioned, the college students loved John, the teeny boppers loved Paul, the mystics loved George, and the grannies loved Ringo. And there's all of them represented it. The children and the grannies loved Ringo. So, and they had songs for everybody. They had songs for children. So when people say, well, yeah, Yellow Submarine and Octopus's Garden, they're just children's songs. Yeah, they are. They're songs for children in a way. And they had songs for people who wanted to think a little bit. And they had songs for people who just wanted a nice tune. And they had songs for people who wanted to become more interested in Eastern mysticism, or and they had songs that I think Lennon writes a song called The Word, in the beginning, I misunderstood, now I've got it, and the word is love. So it's the essence of John's gospel there. And I think they were deeply religious in many ways, because they grew up in a culture that was religious, and like a lot of young people, they reject what they have grown up with, and that's what they did. And I think they look to America, they look to consumerism and fame, and they realized they were kind of empty. And then they looked to ways of trying to expand their consciousness through drugs. And I think that's, in a way, it's a healthy thing to do, in a way, because it's it could lead you towards anthroposophy or to other places but it's dangerous as well. It can open up doors, and it can lead you into places that you don't want to go. But so can walking down the road one day. You can end up somewhere you didn't want to end up. You have to venture outside your comfort zone, I suppose. And I think they did that, and people went along with them, and the culture was going that way. And then I think they ended up in meditation and in India and in ideas of karma and reincarnation. And suddenly people started trying to understand what these ideas were in a very naive way. It's naive without a doubt, but it's somewhere to start. And I think particularly George and John Lennon continued on trying to find something that was deeper. And I know they came across anthroposophy because The Fool, who was one of the Dutch groups that did artwork for them, were kind of interested in anthroposophy. And I know they had come across theosophy and things like that. And their own individuals who that's a different thing. I how deeply they all went into these areas, and where they could go individually is that's a different story, and I think George Harrison very much grasps ideas, spiritual scientific ideas. Unfortunately, I think it's too bound up with India in a way, in some ways, and I think so. That's what I mean by the esoteric, and also I think even the band themselves, you can see a representation of Steiner's the human form, the human being in fourfold nature, and the etheric, the physical, the astral, the ego. I think it's represented there in that band, with Lennon as the ego, McCartney as the astral, George is the etheric mystic, and Ringo is you're just the drummer keeping the beat. And
wow, that's cool. I mean, that is great. I would never have thought of that. That's really great. I think yeah, go on.
I think that's why they were successful, because they are a representation of the human being in a way. And so that's why they were so easy to relate to. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean it's great, and everyone could relate. That is the amazing thing. Everyone had their favorite. Everyone,
Yeah.
liked this one, liked that one, and they
So if
they
you
were able to write songs for everyone. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, you've got the children's songs, you've got songs for older people, you've got songs for rebellious teenagers. You've got the whole lot, and yeah, I don't know if
so
you've.
so I think
So go on.
I think you see, I'm not really saying it's, John and George and Paul were some kind of initiates that, I'm not saying that. They just were vehicles that came together, but the nature of which they came together represented how things are in its kind of nearly perfect form, in its spiritual form. And that's why it was such a force. And we often hear of this thing called the fifth Beatle. And of course, with the four, there's always the fifth element or the quintessential aspect. So when these four come together, you get this, it's there's the fifth element. And some people call that in a way the Holy Spirit could now enter, and you have this perfect form. I suppose the 5-pointed star, or the human form again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's again why they were such a force. So it's the force. It's like a Christ-like force that is working through this period, and they were a kind of a just a vehicle for that. And it's interesting, I think, that again, it's possible. So when just the occult aspect, I'm really trying to refer to occult there, yeah, in its hidden sense, but also more so in its negative connotation, where there were darker forces. I think that when there's any light there, that's when darker forces are drawn towards it, and they
Mm-hmm.
want to manipulate it, and they want to distort it, and they want to lead it where they can lead it, because dark forces cannot lead something that isn't there, and the light brings it into being, and then it is able to be manipulated, and I think that happened on in their own individual lives, in their own selves. And I think it happened on a cultural level. And I think some very dark forces entered into that period. And it really destroyed it. And whether that was supposed to happen, it only had its own lifespan, or whether it could have developed into something else is hard to say. But it definitely suddenly just died, 69, I think. And I think even you can see that whole death, that the birth and the growth and the decay of the 60s through the Beatles, through the albums, through their relationship with themselves and with the public. So by the time you get to, I think, the White Album, it's very clear everything is falling apart, and by the time you get back, it's just it's over. It's nearly a dinosaur,
Right. Yeah. So could you say something to this? I've heard from a few different people about John. He had a conversation with someone, like, just to get into specifics a little bit more. John had a conversation with someone where they suggested that, hey, you guys, the Beatles, you're controlled. Don't you realize you're controlled? That that they're using you. They're using you basically. I don't know. Is it the CIA or whatever are actually using you? Could you say anything to that?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, Marshall McLuhan, I think you're
Oh, that's
referring
right. Yeah,
to,
that was it.
had told John Lennon that there was kind of a useful idiot in a way, that they had used them to um, propagate their own particular agendas, etc., um, to bring this drug culture about that would cause chaos and
Right.
And there's a book called Acid Dreams, which is about the CIA's involvement with them. And there is a lot of speculation, fairly grounded, I think, about Timothy Leary being associated with the CIA and other people to do with the Mansons and that whole Laurel Canyon area. And as I said, shadowy forces that came in and tried to manipulate and bring it about in particular direction. But it brings us back to an earlier point of, and this is something Terry talked about in your interview before, about the Anglo-American relationship, where the Americans took over from the British to as the guiding force in this cultural epoch. And I think, in a way, this relationship between the British invasion, etc., was, I think, pretty much from the beginning, a cementing of the relationship between Britain and America through the youth culture in these groups.
Right.
Now, I feel that this was at the same time something that was allowed by the higher spiritual forces to happen, because America had to become the dominant force, and Britain had to become close to Britain, not just through wars and politics, but on a cultural level. And so I think the Beatles were supposed to do that, as were a lot of the British groups that came over from an esoteric point of view. In other words, spiritually, that was a door that had to open. But politically, I think certain political minds knew they had to cement this relationship, but that's got nothing to do with the capacities, in a way, of the individuals who wrote that music, or where it streamed from into them. And it's kind of hard to know, like, I mean, how good they were as songwriters and musicians is kind of a mystery, because they didn't seem to have been particularly great to begin with, and were all of the songs and music that was given to them, in a way, gifts that came to them. And in a way, I think they talk about this a lot, that the ideas just came.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of phenomenal, isn't it, when you look at the amount of material they wrote and how the quality of so much of it. It's just ridiculous. It's like, I mean, I know that they forged a lot of things, how they played together and everything in Hamburg. I lived in Hamburg for 4.5 years, and was always kind of excited that it was a Beatles city. But they played, the story goes that they played, I don't know, what was it, 16-hour days of playing constantly, and they really forged something. But that doesn't explain how you then become these incredible songwriters that write such great songs and write so many of them, does it?
No. So whether they had karmically, prepared themselves for this incarnation to be such good songwriters, but I definitely think, there was music that was given to them to as a healing force, to move the culture along, to make this connection between Britain and America much stronger culturally. And certainly they obviously have had gifts, because when they split up and went their own ways, and they were still able to write very, very good songs, but definitely not with the same level of, heart forces or connection that they had when they were with the Beatles. But Dylan, it was the same. You were talking about Dylan earlier. You just thinking, just a phenomenal amount of songs, and they're so simple as well, particularly with Dylan. You're just thinking, when they're so simple, how does he get all these? And I think they all kind of seem to say they don't really know. They just kind of happened for them. And so it's just like they're kind of antennas or something for this to happen, you know. And I think it was very rich, you know, very, very rich musically. All these kids really suddenly creating all these. I mean, there's loads of these, you know, there's the Brian Wilson, there's, you know, even groups like, you know, the Mamas and the Papas are the Loving Spoonful, or, you know, Donovan, or, you know, there's just so many of them with these, all these wonderful the songs. And so yeah, it was very rich, I think. And but I do think they started to be kind of manipulated and used, and for many reasons, for money, for politics, for other occult reasons.
Maybe you could go into that a little bit for us. So, you know, I don't know where you want to start. It's probably a big topic to get into at this point, but you know, who was trying to use them? Why were they trying to use them? How were they using them? Maybe you just want to pick one of those, whether it's governmental or occult. I mean, what are the occult, the dark side of the occult trying to do with them, trying to use them for, do you think?
Well, I think, yeah, so I at the same time, while karma and reincarnation and these things came through to Western culture to a large extent, popularized through the Beatles, a relationship with the Maharishi and with the Hare Krishnas, and with, I mean, they very bravely, I think, were on programs like the David Frost show. I'm not sure if you're aware of that show, but it was a huge show in Britain during the 60s.
I've heard of it, yeah, but yeah.
So John and George are on at one point talking about reincarnation, karma and reincarnation, and meditation and these things.
Right.
And I mean, George is 25 at the time. It's very interesting to you can see it on YouTube, you know. And I mean, it's so profound. A 25-year-old like talking about something to an audience who, this is just like, you know, not at all part of their tradition. You're not going to sit down on a whatever evening it was, Saturday evening, and suddenly this 25-year-old is suddenly talking about karma and reincarnation in a very, you know, Church of England country.
Yeah,
and very particularly talking about it. I mean, very complex language, but very eloquently. I mean, it's really impressive, I think. Because most 25-year-olds are not thinking about that, really, you know. But to be able to articulate it as well and talk about, and I think George really, you know, it became very, for him, very important to think about why you're here and where you're going, and what's your purpose in life, and how do you evolve and fulfill your potential, and these kind of things. It was really, really important. And we I think to some extent television and that provided that a little bit to that period, where you would see actors like, I remember seeing an interview with Richard Todd, who was one of these kind of, you know, war movie actors, like or people like Richard Burton and people like that. And they would talk very eloquently about art and culture and, you know, things that were, you know, not just trivial nonsense. They were serious conversations, and it was very healthy to have these conversations and to be able to follow them and to, you know, develop your capacity to think and listen. And so you know, that's very profound, I think, and both of them are there talking about this. and they talk about the Christ consciousness, and they talk about these things. However, unfortunately, I think what that has done is allowed for all these Eastern influences to come in that, in a way, from an anthroposophical point of view, are right for India and right for the makeup of those people and for the time that it was there, but quite detrimental for the Western individual. And so from that perspective, I think they were used to naively to allow these shadowy forces to come in, and suddenly we have yoga and all sorts of meditation things that I don't think Western individual understands, is made for, has a grasp of properly, and
that's interesting point. I often talk to people about this in my work, sort of spiritual development, mentoring kind of work that I do. And it's not that we're saying that meditation's a bad thing. We're not saying that the religions of the East and the Eastern way of thinking is a bad thing in any way, shape, or form. But what we've done with meditation, for example, is we've just yanked it out of its cultural context, out of its historical context, out of its religious context, and just sort of plonked it over here and said, oh, those monks over there look happy, let's do what they're doing. But without sort of the grounding, because I mean the goal of meditation is really spiritual awakening, and spiritual awakening isn't necessarily a pleasant, happy, peaceful experience. Often, the Buddhists talk about stirring up the sediment at the bottom of the glass is what you're doing with meditation, in a sense. And so what Steiner was able to do was to give the West, or give back to the West, its own meditative path, which keeps the intellectual development of the West but enhances it, in a sense, you could say. And I just want to make that clear to people listening. It's not anything negative about what we've taken from the East at all. It's just the way we've done it. And I get what you mean. It's really it can lead to all sorts of problems. And I mean, lots of people who come into my sphere with my work come and say, look, I've been trying to meditate for 20 years and I can't do it. Or they've had schizophrenic tendencies due to what happened with meditation. You mentioned drugs before, and sometimes drugs do lead to a widening of consciousness, but they can also go the complete opposite way, obviously, and lead to mental illness and all kinds of things. So I really like the way you've brought that up, though, this image of George on this mainstream, well, there was only mainstream TV back then, I suppose, but there he is talking to the whole country, probably the UK, people sitting down to have their dinner and listening to him. And there he is talking about reincarnation and karma. It's just incredible, really, that he was able to do that, and that what that did. But it's had its negative consequences as well as bringing the positive concept of the idea into the West.
Yeah, and so I think if you talk about the idea of karma and reincarnation, again, from an anthroposophical point of view, humanity is ready in the West to receive this idea again. And that's why Rudolf Steiner talked about it, and talked about it quite a lot. And so if he's talking about it in the early 1900s, to a select audience, in a way, yes. I presume middle class theosophists and things like that, it's not particularly open to, and I'm not saying Steiner didn't want to tell other people. They just weren't ready for, this was his audience. And so, in a way, George Harrison and John Lennon appearing on this show for the whole nation of Britain, and probably the whole world, in a way, listening to these people, who were extremely well known at this, to now bring what Steiner was talking about, 60 or 70 years earlier, to the consciousness of the whole culture is, I mean, that in itself is to me a mission accomplished there,
Right. Yes. Yeah.
that people can now consider this notion and
Yes.
think, oh, and they can go and look for themselves and find out for themselves. And I'm sure many people who heard that, who go off and find out about karma and reincarnation, some of them will have come across Rudolf Steiner's lectures on karma and reincarnation. But until this idea is introduced, dark forces can't manipulate it or do anything with it. So I think, in a way, it has brought about all sorts of stuff. And I don't think the Beatles were aware enough at all that they were being used like this, or these forces could come in and cause havoc in their own lives, in their own environments, and cause damage as well on another level, as with the drugs and things like that. But certainly things couldn't have stayed the way they were at the beginning of the 60s. There was an awakening. There was suddenly going from singing songs about wanting to hold your hand to different states of consciousness and all sorts of other ideas, and principally the concept of love, I think, then, which becomes central to their music, really, but particularly from a lyrical point of view, Lennon. So when you say all you need is love, again, you're back to the word of Jesus Christ. And there's no getting away from that. That's the message.
Well, Sorry, go on.
That I think is the principal message of the whole Beatles career, is all you need is love, really, but again, it gets used and abused and twisted, and from these, as I said, these forces. I heard there the other day somebody talking about the BBC was developed by Tavistock, was funded by Tavistock and MI5 and things like that, as a means to control the masses. And I think there's probably a huge amount of truth in that, because anyone who wants to have control over the masses is going to use whatever means possible. And but it doesn't mean that they invented television and they invented all these things it came about, and they thought, well, this is a good way to program people, just as they've been programming people in other ways through newspapers and before.
I think that's a really good point, because that brings us back to when people are saying, I think, and I'm guilty of this myself, but you hear, well, I grew up thinking the Beatles were great, brilliant, loved them, wonderful, and then you hear these darker sides to the tale, and then you flip over to the other side and you think, oh, they're all bad and it was all evil and rock music and everything like that. And you sound like some sort of fundamentalist, but there's so many subtleties to it. There's so many gray areas, and it's not just this person's bad, that person's good, or this movement's good and this movement's bad. You just can't do that. And so I think what you've done with this chat tonight is really go into these things in a non-dogmatic way. And I think what you came to just before, where John's lyrics, all you need is love, is really can be seen as the theme of the whole thing. And I mean, that's been used, and everything good can be used in a negative way, can't it? But I think what you've come to there is what you've presented is a really good balance throughout this. I really look forward to reading the
Well,
book.
I mean, if we think of Christianity, I mean, what other, I mean, it's the impulse for all of humanity, but it's been twisted and used and distorted
exactly
more than anything else. So,
mm-hmm.
And so I don't want people to think that, the Beatles are writing a book to say the Beatles are some kind of Christ beings. I'm not. They're just four guys from a working class neighborhood. But that's what's kind of interesting, is that and that's what I mean. They weren't like princes in a sense. They weren't remarkable figures through history that have carried an impulse. They were just ordinary blokes from Liverpool and so I think this impulse, all you need is love, is being grasped by fully grasped by the common person. It's not a love of family or nation or these things. Lenin is understanding it as a Christ force, I think, as a universal brotherhood. He's understanding it in himself, because I think he's gone through these experiences of being a working class guy that nobody is interested in, to suddenly being a rock star, to suddenly being, extremely famous, an artist, very rich, and realizing, and I think so. There's a chapter in the book, bigger than Christ, it ain't easy, the bigger than Jesus fiasco for him, and I think Lenin, in a sense, at that time, probably did think they were bigger than Jesus, in the way that, they made all these excuses that I wasn't saying that. I was talking about, I think there's that, but I think in a way they were so huge, and they were being pulled at, and people wanting to touch them, and just so you can imagine how the luciferic element just is, and throw some drugs in there, and megalomania. So I think in a way he probably did think that, and was suddenly brought back down to earth with a land. And I think after that, I think he went through experiences of actually, I think it's interesting through the songs where he sings help. He's screaming for help because he's in a total state of despair. And he has a line in that which I only realized when I was writing the book. And now I find I've changed my mind. I've opened up the door, and I think it was his written around that he sang that. They had recorded that song at some point, but he went in later and redid the lyric. And I think he was either aware of Huxley's Doors of Perception, and the idea of drugs opening up. So he's changed his mind and he's opened up the door. So he's trying to expand his consciousness and to understand the world on a deeper level. Because he's in a state of suffering, really. Like, he realizes the world is, the physical world we live in is a world of suffering, and the only way out is through some kind of transcendence, I suppose. But after that album, he writes the song, The Word, and I think at some point he's connected somehow that this is the only real answer to the suffering, and within 2 years, he's, I think, fully realized this is the only answer. I don't think by any means he realized it in his own self, but was really grasping it. He was understanding, I think, what this message is. this Christ message is about love. I think I get the feeling they experienced everything that you could experience. It just comes down to love. The money and the fame and the songs and the adulation and it just isn't. It's really, yeah, this, whatever this is something beyond these. And I think they did experience something like that. I think particularly Lennon and Harrison got close to that somehow, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, well, I think that might be a good place to wind it up. I mean, I could ask you a million other things. I think what I like to do is read the book and then have a chat to you again in a few months' time and ask you some questions, because we didn't get onto things. Just going through the contents, I just saw Paul is dead, or that question. I did ask you about John realizing that the Beatles were possibly being used. You mentioned something about which we have to get to next time as well, but the Beatles arriving in the States, was it just after JFK or just after one of the Kennedy assassinations? But anyway, let's leave that for next time. Sean, thank you very much for the chat tonight. I mean, what you have knowledge of brings so many things together for me, being someone who's been, involved in anthroposophy for over 20 years now, and then being a singer-songwriter and musician. And so just seeing your book and hearing about you when you got in touch was just like, oh, wow, this brings a lot of amazing things together for me. So thank you very much for the chat tonight. And is there somewhere that people can find your writings easily and buy your books and get in contact with you? Or
well, they can. That book is due for release on April the 21st, actually, through Amazon or any. So Clairview Press, which is an imprint of Rudolf Steiner Press. You go to their website, or I think Amazon or anywhere like that should have it.
Okay.
The other books are Amazon or
okay, great. Well, I'll put some links into the description in the video anyway, so that people can find you. And other than that, I just often say at the end here as well, if people are interested in helping to support this podcast so I can keep continuing to make these episodes, then you can support me over at Subscribestar. It's subscribestar.com/Mick Young. And other than that, Sean, thanks very much for joining me, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Mick. That was a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on, even though I asked you to have me on, but thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks very much, mate. Take care. Thanks very much for listening to the Spiritual Scientist podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can make a one-time donation via PayPal, or if you'd like to become a member, you can make a recurring donation via Subscribestar. The podcast can be found on all good podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, and Google, and the video format can be found on Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, Brighteon, and YouTube. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.